ever walk past a bakery, and get hit with that wave of fresh bread, like
Ugh.
instantly makes your mouth water.
Yeah.
Or how about this? How about the smell of rain?
Right.
Can bring back like these vivid childhood memories for people, right?
Absolutely.
Our senses are pretty amazing. It's
Yeah.
how we experience, you know, everything.
Everything. Yeah.
So today, we're diving deep into how our senses work, how these senses work, and how they've shaped us as humans,
Right.
how they make us us.
Absolutely. I mean, it's true. We really do take our senses for granted.
Yeah.
I mean, we assume they're going to be there,
Right.
but each one is just this marvel of evolution, shaped over millions of years,
Right.
to help us survive and thrive.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about like what we would be like without them.
Yeah.
Like if we couldn't rely on them.
Right.
So let's start with vision. I've always kind of thought humans we're pretty visually dominant. Like we rely on our vision, arguably more than a lot of other living things.
Right.
Is that true?
It's interesting. I mean, it's more nuanced than that, I would say.
Okay.
While our vision is excellent for what we need it for, it's not necessarily the most powerful out there. Hey,
Right.
take for instance birds and fish. A lot of birds and fish can see ultraviolet light,
Really?
which is totally invisible to
Well,
us.
they're seeing things like completely different.
A whole different, yeah, like patterns on flowers that we can barely even perceive. It'd be like a whole secret world of color we're missing out on.
A Secret World of Color. That's kind of a great band name.
It is, yeah.
Um, okay, so that's wild. So like if birds and fish they win, like the Vision Olympics or whatever,
Mm.
like where do humans fit in the animal kingdom?
Well, we've evolved to kind of excel in other ways. So, for instance, most mammals, if you look at most mammals, they have pretty basic color vision, right?
Right.
We're trichromatic.
Okay.
We're rocking 3 types of color detecting cells called cones in our eyes.
Okay.
And most mammals only have 2,
Hmm.
which means their whole world looks like this kind of like faded photograph, mostly yellows and blues.
Oh, okay.
So, a little dull for us.
So that's why, like, my dog ignores that red toy I keep throwing.
Right.
He just sees, like, a grayish...
Yeah, they don't get it. They don't see it the way we do.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so our color vision, it's like it helped us adapt to a life where we need to see a lot more color.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's all about what's useful for our niche, in
Yeah.
the world.
Mm.
Like being able to distinguish, ripe fruit from the fruit that's not ready yet, or if there's a predator hiding. Like those are the evolutionary pressures that really shaped how we see.
It's not about having the, quote, best vision. It's about having the best vision for our needs.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's talk about hearing for a second.
Sure.
What makes our ears special?
Well, have you ever noticed how, even if you're in a really noisy room,
Yeah.
you can pick out like what your friend is saying to you pretty easily?
Yeah.
That's not an accident. That's because our ears are incredibly sensitive to a very specific range of frequencies,
Okay.
specifically the frequencies of sound that make up human speech.
Okay, so it's fine-tuned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's typically between like 1,000 and 6,000 hertz,
Okay.
which that's our sweet spot. That's where we pick up all the subtle little inflections and, the nuances that make language so complex.
So we're meant to hear each other talk.
We're meant for it, yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. But lots of animals make sounds, right?
Yeah.
So like what sets us apart then?
You're right. A lot of animals communicate with sound. But language, like language as we know it with, all the grammar, all the syntax, this ability to convey really abstract ideas
Yeah.
that's uniquely human.
Right.
And our hearing evolved alongside that, right?
Yeah.
To perceive it and process all those intricate sound patterns.
So it's like our ears and our brains like teamed up to make language possible.
They work together, yeah.
Okay, shifting gears just a little bit here. To a sense that honestly it doesn't always get a lot of love.
Okay.
And that's smell.
Yeah.
I always hear that, humans, we have a terrible sense of smell.
Right.
Compared to like dogs or.
Yeah.
But this book is suggesting that's not the whole story.
Yeah, it's a misconception. I mean, while it is true that like dogs, they have an overall more sensitive sense of smell. Like if you had to compare like,
Right.
1-to-1.
Yeah.
Humans are actually surprisingly good at detecting certain scents.
Okay.
especially ones that come from like, flowers and fruits.
Eh.
Oh yeah, there are even studies where humans straight up outperform dogs.
What?
Yeah. In identifying specific odors.
I always assumed dogs had us beat in like every smelling contest. Like
Right.
what's the secret? Like what's going on there?
It all comes down to our olfactory receptors.
Okay.
These tiny sensors in our noses,
Mm.
and they detect different odor molecules.
Okay.
And we have millions of them.
Mhm.
And here's the fascinating part.
Okay.
Each person, each person's set of receptors, it's unique,
Okay.
creates what they call a smell fingerprint.
A smell fingerprint.
Mhm.
So like my experience of smelling a rose
Yeah.
is actually different
Yes.
from someone else's.
Yeah, on a physical level.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
It is. It's like, that's why certain scents will like trigger, really strong emotional responses or memories in one person, but then not for someone else.
Totally.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's incredibly personal.
That's really interesting.
It is, yeah.
So it's not just about, oh, this is pleasant or unpleasant.
Right.
It's almost like how it connects to our individual like database.
Exactly, yeah. Our experiences, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really cool way to think about it.
Yeah, it's amazing what we're learning.
Okay, so before we go too far down this smell rabbit hole,
Right.
let's talk about taste.
Sure.
How does that fit into this whole puzzle?
Well, I mean, taste is all about survival, right?
Mhm.
It lets us know what's good to eat, what could be dangerous,
Right.
and humans, we're omnivores.
Right.
We've evolved a sense of taste that reflects that diversity in our diets. We've got to be able to enjoy the sweetness of like a perfectly ripe, peach, but also detect the bitterness that might mean, yeah, like, don't eat that.
Something's wrong.
Yeah.
That makes total sense. So our taste buds they're kind of walking this line
Right.
between, keeping us alive
Right.
and also letting us enjoy delicious food.
Exactly.
I can get behind that for sure.
Yeah.
I am curious though, like if it's all about, survival,
Mm-hmm.
how many taste buds we're working with here?
So we have somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 taste buds,
Okay.
which, that might sound like a lot,
Yeah.
but if you compare that to other animals, it's actually right in the middle.
Really?
Yeah. So carnivores, like think about, lions, tigers, bears,
They just eat meat.
they just eat meat and they have way fewer taste buds because their diets are just way less varied.
Okay.
Herbivores, on the other hand,
Mm-hmm.
plants,
Right.
they need a lot more taste buds
Makes sense.
because they need to be able to navigate all those complex flavors, all those different compounds.
Right, because like one plant can taste totally different from another.
Totally. And they need to know,
Yeah.
like, is this going to make me sick?
Mhm.
Is this okay to eat?
It's like life or death for them.
Yeah.
Interesting. So we're just right there in the middle
Right in the middle.
between the steak lovers
Yeah.
and the salad connoisseur.
There you go. Yeah, that's us.
That's us. It's wild to think about how our taste buds reflect our place, in the grand scheme of things.
It is, isn't it?
Okay, so we've talked about, how our senses, they make us human.
Right.
But they vary from person to person, right? Like my experience of something is going to be different from yours.
Right.
So like how much of our sensory experience, how much is like hardwired by evolution versus like how much is uniquely us?
That's a great question, and it's this really interesting interplay of nature and nurture.
Okay.
And there are a lot of different ways that this plays out.
Okay.
One example is, take the differences between like men and women.
Okay.
Research shows that women, on average, tend to have more sensitive senses than men.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
I always thought that was like a stereotype.
Yeah, no, this one actually has some scientific backing.
Interesting.
So, for instance, smell's a big one.
Okay.
Women tend to be much more sensitive to smells, and often they can detect them at lower concentrations than men can.
Okay, so I wasn't imagining things when I was like, oh, I smell burnt popcorn and
Right.
like no one else could smell it.
You probably did smell it first.
Yeah. Okay, it's nice to know I'm not crazy. Why is that though? Is it hormones? What's the deal?
So it's likely, it goes back to our evolutionary history.
Okay.
A keener sense of smell and taste, especially for women during pregnancy,
Yeah.
would have been so crucial, to help them avoid foods that could be harmful to a developing baby.
Right, because that's like such a sensitive time, right,
Yes.
for
And
development.
there's even research that suggests that women are particularly sensitive to bitter tastes.
Mhm.
And that's often a signal that, hey, there could be toxins in this food.
It's like this superpower passed down through generations to protect, to protect, you know?
It's like a, yeah, like a sixth sense
It
almost.
totally, yeah. Okay, so I gotta ask though,
Yeah.
do men get any bragging rights when it comes to senses?
They do have some advantages.
Okay.
Um, when it comes to vision, there are some differences.
Okay.
On average, men, they tend to have slightly better visual acuity, which means they can pick out those finer details a little bit better.
Okay.
And they also tend to excel at tracking those fast-moving objects.
So that's why I can never find my keys, but my husband can spot them from like across the room.
Right.
Interesting. Is that like, the hunter-gatherer thing? Like,
That's a theory. That's a theory.
yeah.
The idea is that those visual strengths in men, it might have helped them with hunting.
Right.
Whereas, other senses were probably more important for gathering and other tasks.
Right, because you got to be able to like spot that animal.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Exactly. You got to have those eagle eyes.
Okay, that's so interesting. And now I kind of hate to bring this up, but we all know, as we get older,
Yeah,
our senses, they change.
they do.
What's the deal with that? Because this book is making it sound kind of scary.
It is. It's one of those things, getting older.
Yeah.
But, it's important to remember that it is a gradual process.
Yeah.
It's not like one day you wake up and like everything's different.
Right.
But it's fascinating to think about how it happens.
Okay.
So remember we talked about how our hearing range is about 20,000 hertz?
Yeah, yeah. You said that's the range of like frequencies we can hear.
Exactly, yeah, like the
Yeah.
highest pitch to the lowest pitch.
Okay.
Well, after about age 20, we start to lose about 1 hertz of that range every single day.
Every day.
Every day.
That's crazy.
It's a slow decline.
Okay.
But it adds up over time.
So that's why teenagers,
Mhm.
they can enjoy those like ear-splitting ringtones
Exactly.
that like the rest of us are cringing at.
Yeah, but by the time we hit our 50s, most of us are struggling to hear those really high frequencies.
It all makes sense now.
I know, right?
Okay, so hearing fades a bit. What about our other senses? Do
Yeah.
they have like an expiration date?
They all experience changes.
Yeah.
It's just, on different timelines.
Okay.
So like take our skin, for instance.
Okay.
As we age, our skin loses those nerve fibers.
Okay.
And that means that our sense of touch, it actually becomes less sensitive,
Mm.
particularly in our hands, our feet, and our face.
So that's why my grandma loved those big squeezy hugs.
Ego.
She was making up for lost time sensation-wise.
Exactly. She just needed to feel it a little bit more.
That's kind of sweet.
It is.
Okay, and then there's smell.
Smell. Yeah.
What's the deal with that?
Smell loss is really common as we get older.
Okay.
By the time you're 80, about 3/4 of people have significant smell impairment.
That's heartbreaking though.
It is sad.
To think about all the wonderful scents that you'd be missing.
Yeah.
Freshly baked cookies
Mhm.
or like, I don't know, the smell of rain. Like those are simple joys.
I know, and you don't really realize what you've got until it's gone,
That's true. That's true.
And it can have other, less obvious consequences too.
Okay, like what?
That thing people say like, oh, old person smell.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not. Like a lack of hygiene.
Okay.
Sometimes it's that they literally can't smell it.
Oh, that's both fascinating and kind of sad at the same time.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how much we rely on our senses.
Right.
Without even like realizing it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we can't escape time.
Right.
Unfortunately not. It's going to, have its effects. But what about genetics?
Yeah.
You talked about that smell fingerprint earlier.
Yeah.
Like how does that work exactly?
So our genes, they play a huge role in how sensitive we are to different scents.
Okay.
We each inherit this unique combination of olfactory receptor genes, and those are those tiny sensors in our noses.
Right.
And there are millions of variations of these genes within the human population.
So like my version
Yeah.
might make me like super sensitive to a scent.
Right.
Someone else can't even like detect it.
Exactly.
Wow.
It's actually incredibly unlikely for any two people
Wow.
to have the exact same set of olfactory receptor genes.
So we're all smelling things differently.
In a way, yeah. Even if we're smelling the same, like, cup of coffee,
Yeah.
our brains might be getting totally different information about it.
That explains so much.
Right.
Like those like wine tasting things, and I'm like, I don't smell that.
Exactly.
It's not my fault, it's my genes.
Exactly. It's like, hey, don't blame me. I can only smell what my genes are letting me smell.
This is blowing my mind. I love this.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's such a good reminder that even our most basic experiences are really shaped by, our biology, our environment,
Right.
all these factors coming together.
It's not just us, it's everything.
Exactly.
It's really amazing to think about how even something as personal as our sense of smell, like there's this whole genetic component to it.
It is. It's like, another layer of what makes us unique.
Totally. But here's where this book like really blew my mind, okay?
Okay.
It talks about how our senses, they seem so personal, but they're also shaped by the cultures we live in.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area to study. Our senses, they don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
They're constantly interacting with, like, the social and cultural norms around us, how we were raised, where we live, all that.
So it's not just about how we experience the world. It's
Mm.
it's almost like our culture teaches us to experience it.
It's like a filter,
Yeah.
and it shapes everything.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And there are some really fascinating examples, even from the animal kingdom,
Okay.
that kind of like illustrate this.
Okay.
So take chimpanzees and bonobos, for example.
Okay.
Did you know that they spend hours every single day grooming each other?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember like reading about that, and I always just kind of assumed it was a hygiene thing.
Well, hygiene's part of it, right? But it's not the whole story.
Okay.
For them, like physical touch, it's crucial
Mm-hmm.
for like building social bonds, maintaining those relationships.
Yeah.
And it actually triggers the release of oxytocin, that hormone.
Oh, the feel-good
The
hormone.
love hormone, the cuddle hormone.
Exactly. So those grooming rituals are like
Yeah.
they're bonding over it.
It's like social glue. It's reinforcing their relationships through touch.
It's like a physical manifestation
Exactly.
of their bond.
And it highlights how important touch can be. Like, not just for them, but for humans too.
Right.
Think about like how good a hug feels,
Totally.
or a handshake, or even just like a pat on the back.
Yeah, you don't realize like how important that is.
Yeah, it can make or break an interaction.
Yeah, and I read about these really, I mean, kind of sad experiments, but where they like deprived babies of touch, and
Right.
it had these like really negative effects.
Yeah, and they didn't thrive.
Yeah.
They really didn't. You're probably thinking about the case of Emperor Frederick II.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking about.
Back in the 13th century.
Yeah.
He wanted to know what language babies would naturally speak if they were never spoken to. So he took a group of infants, isolated them. They were given basic care, but no interaction, no affection, no touch.
Yeah, that's really sad.
It was a heartbreaking failure. The infants, they didn't develop properly. They
Yeah.
couldn't form attachments. Most of them actually didn't survive.
Wow.
And it's a tragic example, but it shows just how important that sensory interaction is
It's essential.
for human development. Yeah.
It's not just like a nice to have, it's really, really crucial. Okay, so we talked about touch.
Yeah.
What about our other senses? How do
So-
those kind of play into this whole idea?
Well, language is a really interesting example.
Okay.
So did you know that the language that we speak can actually influence how we see color?
Wait, really?
Yeah.
I always just assumed that was purely biological, like how my eyes perceive color is how my guys perceive color?
It turns out it's more complex than that. So there was this fascinating study done, and they were comparing native Korean speakers
Okay.
to native English speakers.
Yeah.
And what they found was Korean has more specific terms for shades of green than English does.
Interesting. So they have a bigger vocabulary, like specifically for the color green.
Exactly, for like all the little subtle variations. And the study found that those Korean speakers were significantly better at distinguishing between those shades of green. It was like their language actually trained their brain to see the colors more distinctly.
Wow, that's wild.
Isn't that interesting?
So the words we use, the language we're exposed to, it shapes how our brain like processes visual information.
That's what it seems like, yeah.
Wow.
It really speaks to like how adaptable our brains are.
Yeah.
They're constantly being shaped by our experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes our cultural
Right,
experiences.
of course.
And it's not just color perception. Our sense of smell, believe it or not, can be influenced by cultural factors as well.
Really?
Oh, yeah. So this book talks about a study on how, like, our cultural associations with certain scents can actually affect our ability to detect them. And they
Oh.
used almonds.
Okay, almonds. Like the snack.
Almonds, exactly, yeah. So in the U.S., we tend to use almonds in, like, sweet treats a lot.
Right, right.
But in Japan, they're more commonly used as a savory snack.
Okay, so different cultures, different almond applications. Where's this going?
So they wanted to see if these cultural associations actually changed people's sensitivity to a related scent, benzaldehyde.
Benzaldehyde, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, I know, right? It's
Yeah.
an organic compound with, like, that characteristic almondy aroma.
Got it, got it. Okay. So they were trying to see if like their experience with almonds, whether it was sweet or savory, would change how they like smelled it.
Exactly. And what they found was remarkable. American participants were much better at detecting, like, very faint traces of benzaldehyde after they had tasted something sweet.
Yeah.
And the Japanese participants, they were more sensitive to it after they had tasted something salty.
No way. So their brain is making these connections between the taste and the smell based on like what their culture had taught them.
It seems so, yeah.
Right.
It suggests that our sensory experiences, they're not purely objective,
Yeah.
like our cultural backgrounds, what we learn, what we're exposed to. It can all, like, prime our senses to be more attuned to certain
Well,
things.
like it's like a learned experience almost.
Halfway, yeah.
That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is really interesting. There's no, like, right way to experience the world through our senses.
Mm-hmm.
It's all filtered.
Totally, yeah. It's all filtered through this lens of culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that cultural lens, it extends to, like, even the importance we place on different senses.
Oh, interesting.
So we've talked a lot about vision today,
Right.
and there's a reason for that.
Okay.
In a lot of Western cultures, vision is considered our dominant sense.
Right.
And that emphasis on vision is reflected in our language.
Okay.
Did you know that, like, a whopping 3/4
What?
of English words that relate to sensory experiences are based on sight?
Really? That many?
Yeah. In contrast, less than 1% of English words are related to smell.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Think about how much, like, richer our vocabulary is for describing what we see
Right.
compared to what we smell.
It's true. If you ask me to describe a smell, I'm usually just like, oh, it's like that one thing or it's like that one time.
Right.
Not very descriptive.
It's true. And it's because culturally we just haven't placed as much emphasis on, like, developing a nuanced vocabulary for it.
Okay, so there are cultures that place more emphasis on smell.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
In some cultures, it's the most important sense.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Like, give me an example.
The Dasana people of the Amazon rainforest,
Okay.
they actually call themselves Waira, which translates to the people who smell.
The people who smell. I love that.
Mm.
So they clearly take their sense of smell very seriously. What does that even mean, though? Like, for their day-to-day life, do they, like, smell each other as a greeting or something?
Not quite, but smell is how they navigate. They use scent trails to find their way through the rainforest. They can identify different plant and animal species just by their unique smells.
So it's like their GPS and their encyclopedia all
Yeah.
rolled into one?
Yeah. And they've developed this incredibly sophisticated vocabulary and understanding of the world all through smell.
Wow, that's amazing.
And they're not alone. The Anji people of the Andaman Islands,
Okay.
they have a different name for each season based on the dominant sense in the air at that time.
Wow.
And they even greet each other by asking about the state of their noses.
That's amazing.
Yeah, they're like, how's your nose doing today?
How's your nose?
Yeah.
That's so funny. Okay, that really shows you how differently cultures prioritize things.
Yeah, and what's considered normal, or important, it just totally varies.
Depending on, yeah, where you are, what you were raised with, all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so interesting. Okay, so, and these cultural differences, like, they can be seen in really surprising places, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, even our physical interaction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you remember that study with the coffee shop
Oh, yeah.
where they, like, measured how often people touched each other in different cities?
Oh, yeah. That was a good one. That's a classic.
That was so interesting.
It's a perfect example of how cultural norms around touch can be totally different depending on where you are.
Right.
So, like, in London, there was almost no touching at all
Yeah.
between strangers. But in San Juan, Puerto Rico, people were touching constantly. A quick touch on the arm, a pat on the back, just like a normal part of their interaction.
It's funny how, like, we don't realize how much our culture shapes those things until we see it done differently.
Totally. Yeah, it's like, oh, I guess that's not how everyone does it.
Right, exactly. It's just so ingrained.
And food is another great example.
Okay.
Like what we think is delicious,
Yeah.
even what we consider to be food in the first place. And it's heavily influenced by, where and how we grew up.
Oh, 100%.
Take cheese, for instance.
Okay, cheese. Love cheese.
As you should. But in Denmark, the average person eats over 60 pounds of cheese per year. In China, it's less than a quarter of a pound per person.
Wow, that is such a big difference.
It's a huge difference.
And it's not like cheese is hard to find in China,
Right.
it's just not as central to their culinary, traditions.
It's just not their thing,
Yeah.
and those cultural preferences, they get passed down through
Right.
generations, and they shape our palates and our experiences from when we're really young.
Right, right. From when we're kids, like my parents always say, I was such a picky eater as a kid, and
Yeah.
it's like, well, yeah, I only ate what you fed me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it all goes back to that, like, what were you exposed to? What was normal in your household growing up?
Okay, so that brings us to, like, I think the ultimate example of culture shaping our senses.
Right.
Gendered colors.
Oh, yes.
Why is everything pink for girls and blue for boys?
It's so fascinating how those norms, they just become so ingrained
Right.
that we don't even question them.
Yeah, it's just how it is.
Right, but it wasn't always this way. Like back in the early 1900s,
Okay.
it was the opposite.
What?
Pink was considered a much more masculine color, and blue was seen as more delicate and feminine.
Wait, so my great-grandpa was wearing like a pink onesie.
There's a good chance
Yeah.
it's possible.
That's hilarious.
Right, but over time, those associations shifted.
Yeah.
Through marketing, through fashion, through all these cultural factors.
Mm.
And today, it's so ingrained, in so many cultures that it even influences little tiny kids' preferences.
Yeah.
There's evidence that, like, girls as young as 2 years old
Yeah.
will gravitate towards pink objects, and boys that same age
Yeah.
will, like, avoid them.
Like without even knowing why.
Exactly.
We've been programmed to associate those colors.
It's wild how deeply ingrained it is.
It really is. It really is. This whole conversation has been so fascinating. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's really cool to think about.
Yeah. I mean, it's not every day you get to do a deep dive into the fascinating world of human senses.
It's not, and we've really just scratched the surface. We've been focusing on the 5 basic senses: sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing.
Right.
But there's so much more out there, like our sense of balance, our perception of time, proprioception, which is like, knowing where your body is in space.
Right.
We experience so much more than we realize.
It really makes you wonder, like, what else is out there that
Yes.
we're just totally unaware of
Right.
because we haven't, like, been taught to understand it.
Yeah. Our brains are wired for so much more than we give them credit for.
Well, I think on that note, we should probably, let our listeners go. But for anyone listening,
Yeah.
I think a good challenge would be like, take some time today
Yeah.
and just like really pay attention.
Notice the world.
Yeah, to your senses, to your sensory experiences.
Okay.
What do you notice?
What do you feel?
Yeah, that maybe you haven't before.
Yeah.
How might your culture be shaping how you perceive everything around you?
It's a really interesting exercise. And honestly, you might be surprised by what you discover.
You just might. And on that note, we will be back next time
Yes.
with another deep dive into a topic
I'm excited.
that is sure to change the way you see the world.
I can't wait.
Until then, happy sensing!